you wake before dawn. Not because you choose to, but because a voice sharp as iron commands it. Your feet, still small enough to fit inside a single sandal of the master who now owns you, touch cold marble. The villa is silent except for the crackle of oil lamps you must light, the rustle of linens you must fold, the whisper of your own breath that you've learned to quiet. You are 10 years old. You are a slave, and in the eyes of Rome, you are nothing more than a tool with a pulse. Before we go further, if you're captivated by these forgotten corners of history, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? It's incredible to see people from every continent united by curiosity about the lives that shaped our past. This is not a story Rome memorialized in marble. There are no statues erected for the thousands of girls who scrubbed its floors, who carried its water, who endured its cruelty in silence. Yet their invisible labor held up the pillars of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever known. Power, Rome understood, was not only military, it was domestic. It was intimate. It was the ability to own not just land, but lives, not just bodies, but futures. And among the most disposable of those lives were young girls, foreign, frightened, and utterly without rights. This is the story of how Rome built its grandeur on their backs, and what that cost in flesh, in memory, in stolen childhood. The Roman slave system was not an accident of history. It was a machine, deliberate and efficient, constructed over centuries to extract maximum labor from conquered peoples. By the 1st century CE, scholars estimate that 1 in every 3 people living in the Italian peninsula was enslaved. Some historians place the number even higher in urban centers like Rome itself. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century CE, clarified the legal reality with chilling precision. Slaves were race, things, not personae, persons. They had no legal standing, no capacity to own property, marry, or testify in court unless under torture. This wasn't cruelty as an aberration. It was doctrine. Girls entered this system through a variety of channels. War was the most common, as Roman legions swept through Gaul, Germania, Hispania, and the eastern provinces. Entire populations were uprooted. Polybius, the Greek historian, embedded with Roman forces, documented how after the fall of Carthage in 146 BCE, 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery in a matter of days. Appian recorded similar scenes following the sack of Corinth that same year. Among the enslaved were girls as young as 7 or 8, deemed old enough to work but young enough to be molded into obedience. Others were born into slavery. Roman law followed the principle of partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. If a woman was enslaved, so too were her children, regardless of the father's status. This ensured a self-replenishing supply of laborers. Some masters incentivized childbirth among female slaves, promising slight improvements in conditions or even freedom after bearing multiple children. But these promises were rarely honored. The jurist Ulpian noted that such arrangements were morally expected but not legally binding. Then there were the sale by families, too poor to feed another mouth. Abandoned infants left at crossroads or rubbish heaps were often collected by slave dealers, raised just enough to be sold. The poet Martial references these practices casually in his epigrams, evidence that such transactions were commonplace, mundane even. To Rome, the supply of slaves was as ordinary as grain shipments from Egypt. The scale was staggering. The slave markets, Venalisium, operated like any other commodity exchange. The largest and most infamous was located near the Temple of Castor in the Roman Forum, though smaller markets dotted provinces from Delos to Alexandria. The island of Delos alone, according to Strabo, could process 10,000 slaves in a single day during its peak. Girls arriving at these markets had already endured weeks or months of transport, chains around their wrists or necks, feet blistered from forced marches. Many had watched their parents killed or separated, their villages burned. By the time they reached the auction block, trauma was already woven into their skin. They were displayed on raised platforms, often naked or nearly so. Roman law permitted full inspection of merchandise. Aulus Gellius, in his Attic Nights, describes how buyers would examine teeth, pull back eyelids, press on limbs to test for disease or deformity. For girls, this inspection extended to assessments of virginity and fertility. The younger and more untouched a girl appeared, the higher her price. Dealers knew this. They dressed children in simple tunics, oiled their skin to appear healthy, and coached them to stand still and silent. Rebellion or tears lowered value. Each girl wore a titulus, a wooden placard hung around her neck, listing origin, age, skills, and any defects. These tags were written in Latin, a language most of the enslaved could not read. A girl from Britannia might be labeled Britannica, Annarum Decum, Docilis, British, 10 years old, teachable. The term docilis was code. It meant she had been sufficiently broken in spirit to obey without resistance. It meant she would not run. It meant she had learned that survival required silence. Prices varied. A healthy girl between 10 and 14 could fetch anywhere from 500 to 2,000 denarii, depending on appearance and perceived utility. For context, a Roman soldier earned roughly 900 denarii per year, a common laborer far less. This was not pocket change. The purchase of a child was an investment, and buyers expected returns. Once sold, the girl's identity was legally erased. Her birth name, if she remembered it, was replaced. A girl from Gaul might be renamed Prima or Secunda, first or second, a numeric placeholder. A girl from Judea might become Fortunata, a cruel irony. These Latin names severed the last thread to origin. Language, too, was suppressed. Speaking in one's native tongue could result in punishment. The goal was not integration, it was annihilation of self. Inside the households of Rome's elite, a new and equally brutal chapter began. The Domus, the Roman household, was a theater of hierarchy. At its head sat the paterfamilias, the male head, endowed by law and tradition with near absolute authority. Below him, a carefully ordered structure. Wife, children, freedmen, skilled slaves, and at the very bottom, the young, unskilled, and foreign-born. Girls, freshly purchased, fell into this last category. Their duties were dictated entirely by the needs and whims of their owners. The wealthiest families employed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of slaves. Each had a designated role. There were cooks, accountants, tutors, doorkeepers, litter-bearers, and hairdressers. Young girls were most often assigned to personal service. They might become a pedicigua, a girl who followed her mistress everywhere, carrying her parasol, her mirror, her cosmetics. They might serve as ornatresses, responsible for dressing their mistress's hair, a task that could take hours and demanded perfection. A single misplaced pin or strand could result in a slap, a beating, or worse. Juvenal, in his sixth satire, offers a window into this world. He describes a Roman matron dissatisfied with her appearance, lashing out at the slave girl responsible for her coiffure. The girl's face is struck, her back whipped, all because a curl did not sit correctly. Juvenal writes this, not to condemn, but to mock the vanity of the mistress. The girl's suffering is scenery. These girls woke before the household stirred. They lit fires, fetched water from the atrium cistern or public fountains, prepared food, and cleaned. They were expected to anticipate needs before they were spoken. A moment's delay could be interpreted as insolence, and insolence, even perceived, invited punishment. Punishment was codified, casual, and constant. The paterfamilias held the right of vita nessus potestas, power of life and death over his slaves. While execution was rare, the threat was always present. Far more common were floggings. The flagellum, a multi-tailed whip, was standard equipment in Roman homes. Seneca, in his letters, noted that some masters kept slaves specifically tasked with discipline, men whose only job was to enforce obedience through pain. For young girls, punishment often occurred in private. A mistress might strike her maidservant in the bathhouse, away from public view. A master might summon a girl to a back room under pretense of instruction, only to deliver cruelty behind closed doors. The poet Martial jokes about a master who had his slave girl's ears pierced as punishment for dropping a cup. This was humor to Rome. It was terror to the child. Branding was another method. Girls who attempted escape or were suspected of theft could be marked with heated iron on the forehead or shoulder. The letters fug, short for fugitivus, runaway, turned the body into a permanent record of defiance. Even if she later earned freedom, the scar remained. Identity could not be reclaimed. Some punishments were designed not to injure, but to humiliate. A girl might be forced to stand in the atrium holding a heavy object above her head for hours. She might be denied food for days. She might be stripped and displayed to the household as an example. Shame was a tool as effective as the whip. And yet, amidst this system of terror, Rome prided itself on being a civilization of laws. Philosophers like Cicero and Seneca wrote treatises on virtue and justice. Stoics preached the equality of souls. But none of this philosophy extended to slaves. Seneca himself owned hundreds. His meditations on mercy did not prevent him from exercising the full extent of his legal rights over those he owned. Let us follow one girl through this machinery. Her name, before Rome, was Aduna. She was 12 years old when Roman soldiers arrived at her village in the hills of Britannia. Her father, a tribal leader, resisted. He was killed in front of her. Her mother and younger brother were taken in a different direction. She never saw them again. Iduna, along with 24 other children, was marched south to the coast, loaded onto a ship, and transported across the Channel to Gaul. From there, overland to Rome. She arrived at the slave market, thin, confused, and silent. A dealer purchased her in bulk, along with a group of other children, cleaned her, fed her just enough to restore color to her cheeks, and brought her back to the block 3 weeks later. This time, she was bought by the steward of a senator's household. She was renamed Secunda. Her life as Iduna was over. Secunda's days began in darkness. She slept on a straw mat in a narrow corridor near the kitchen. She rose when the cook's assistant shook her awake, usually an hour before dawn. Her first task was to light the oil lamps in the atrium and the triclinium, the dining room. She learned quickly that the lamps had to burn evenly. Too much oil, and they smoked. Too little, and they sputtered. Both errors earned her a slap from the head slave, a Greek man who had served the family for 20 years and took pride in his authority. After the lamps, she fetched water. The senator's villa had an internal fountain fed by aqueduct. but it was not always running. When it failed, she and another girl carried amphorae to the public fountain 2 streets away, filled them, and carried them back. The jars were heavy. Her shoulders ached. She learned to walk with her knees bent, distributing the weight. She learned not to spill a drop. By mid-morning, she was stationed outside the mistress's chamber. The senator's wife, a woman named Cornelia, required constant attendance. Secunda helped her dress, fastened her jewelry, held the mirror, while the ornatrix styled her hair. She stood silent, invisible, a piece of furniture. Once she sneezed. Cornelia struck her across the face and sent her to the kitchen without food for the rest of the day. In the afternoon, Secunda was often tasked with minding the senator's youngest daughter, a girl only a year younger than herself. She played with the child, sang to her, told her stories. The daughter called her by name, sometimes even smiled at her. But when the daughter grew bored or frustrated, she was allowed to hit Secunda without consequence. It was training. The girl was learning the boundaries of power. Evenings brought no rest. Secunda served at dinner, refilling cups, clearing plates, standing in the corner in case she was needed. The senator and his guests spoke freely in her presence. They discussed politics, scandals, business. She was not a person to them. She was air. At night, she returned to her mat, exhausted, and tried to remember her mother's face. She found that she could not. The memory was fading. Language, too, was slipping. She had not spoken her native tongue in over a year. The few words she whispered to herself in the dark felt strange on her tongue, like trying to hold water in her hands. The consequences of this system extended far beyond individual suffering. Rome's reliance on slave labor created a society fundamentally distorted by exploitation. Free laborers could not compete with the cost-free work of the enslaved, leading to widespread unemployment among the lower classes. The influx of slaves depressed wages and concentrated wealth in the hands of the elite. Social mobility, already limited, became nearly impossible for the poor. For the enslaved themselves, the psychological toll was immeasurable. Modern scholars have explored the concept of social death, a term coined by sociologist Orlando Patterson to describe the condition of slaves who are legally and socially erased. They exist physically, but are treated as non-beings. For young girls in Rome, this erasure was total. They had no family name, no inheritance, no future outside their master's will. They could not testify in court, own property, or enter contracts. They were, in every legal sense, ghosts. Yet Rome kept meticulous records, and some fragments survive. Funerary inscriptions occasionally name slaves, particularly those who earned freedom. One epitaph from the 1st century CE reads, "Secunda, freed by her mistress Cornelia, lived 34 years, faithful and obedient." Such inscriptions are rare and bitterly ironic. The qualities praised, faithfulness, obedience, are the very ones enforced through violence. Archaeological evidence also tells stories. Skeletal remains from slave burial sites show patterns of injury consistent with repetitive labor and physical abuse. Fractures that healed poorly, signs of malnutrition, teeth worn down from coarse food. These bones are the only testimony some of these girls will ever give. And still, Rome could not look away from its own reflection. In every polished bronze mirror held by a slave girl, in every silent figure standing in the corner of a banquet hall, the empire saw its own face and called it civilization. The girls who built that reflection were never meant to be remembered. But their absence is a presence. Their silence is a scream that echoes across to millennia. The machinery of Roman slavery did not collapse from moral awakening. It faded slowly across centuries as economic conditions shifted and Christianity's spread introduced new, though still limited, protections for the enslaved. But for the girls who lived through it, there was no epilogue of justice. There was only endurance, and for most, an unmarked grave. They were children who carried the weight of an empire on shoulders too small for the burden. They were voices Rome refused to hear, and yet, if we listen closely to the surviving sources, to the casual cruelties recorded by poets, the offhand remarks of jurists, the cold efficiency of auction records, we can still hear them, not in words, but in the shape of the silence, not in monuments, but in their absence from them. Rome built its glory on their suffering, and that truth, uncomfortable as it is, remains carved into history as deeply as any inscription in marble. But there is another truth, quieter yet equally enduring. Every empire that forgets the humanity of those who sustain it plants the seeds of its own undoing. Rome believed its system eternal, unquestionable, ordained. Yet within its villas and workshops, in the dim corridors where enslaved girls moved like shadows, the contradictions grew. An empire that claimed virtue while normalizing cruelty could not remain unchallenged forever. Some resisted in ways too small for historians to record: a hidden coin, a smuggled message, a broken tool blamed on wear. Others resisted simply by remembering who they were, by clinging to a name whispered only in the dark. And although Rome tried to erase them, the fragments that remain reveal a society built on a silence that was never truly silent. Today, when we walk through museum galleries and admire Roman mosaics, sculptures, and frescoes, it is easy to forget who cleaned the floors beneath those artworks, who ground the pigments, who carried the water, who lit the lamps. Their fingerprints are on every masterpiece, though they were never permitted to sign their names. In remembering them now, even imperfectly, we restore a small measure of what was taken. Their stories are not lost. They were simply waiting for someone to care enough to listen.